Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we learn? John J. Dwyer? I don't know anything about Pretty Boy Floyd, except he was a bad guy.
Well, Gwen, this is indeed the story of a man that many Oklahomans, such as yourself, may have heard of. But that's about it. Few of us realize, for one thing, he was a lifelong Oklahoman himself. And he had an absolutely one-of-a-kind story that hardly anybody knows. Indeed, if violent, charismatic idol of the common folk Jesse James had a 20th century heir, I'm going to nominate it as being Charles Arthur Floyd. This farm boy son of the Cookson Hills of eastern Oklahoma was weaned on the exploits of James and his fellow Confederate guerrillas, who did not halt their war when the South surrendered in 1865 against a federal government who had ravaged their homeland, and they believed still was. Floyd's own legend loomed large enough while he lived that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover named him America's public enemy number one. It grew larger still on the pages of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and when sung by Woody Guthrie as he strummed his guitar. So who was Charlie Floyd, better known to history as Pretty Boy Floyd? Well, he endures as one of the most fascinating and enigmatic figures in Oklahoma history that you never heard of. A lightning-quick and deadly accurate marksman, even when under fire, he committed spectacular felonies and killed lawmen in shootouts. The final year of his life, American law enforcement from coast to coast, through its collective might, including numerous legendary individual lawmen, into the pursuit of this country boy criminal from Sequoyah County. Polite and good-natured, however, he never shot first, did not commit most of the crimes attributed to him, and was so well-liked from childhood onward by those who knew him, and even many who did not, including numerous law enforcement officials, that the Cookson Hills became a virtual haven for him from the law. And he despised that famous nickname you mentioned a moment ago of Pretty Boy. It reflected his striking, square-jawed handsomeness, and its creation was attributed to a whole variety of sources, including an old girlfriend. But it may also have been a man describing him when reporting the first serious crime in which Floyd participated. His family, though, call him Charlie, and they and friends called him Chalk, apparently due to his appreciation for the well-known homebrew concoction credited to, at least with partial truth, the Choctaws. One reason for the conflicted views that have persisted regarding Charlie Floyd with many Oklahomans is the sense of Greek tragedy overarching even his entree into crime. He possessed a gregarious, daredevil spirit like countless other energetic American boys who excel in athletics, which he did. Some Cookson Hills observers remembered him as the greatest basketball player ever produced by the area when he was in high school. Lawmen later commented on his remarkably powerful and muscular physique, and in their final pursuit of him, his blazing foot speed. His daring led, however, through his own mistakes, but also some bad breaks, to that life of crime. In particular, after completing his first prison term, he attempted to secure legitimate employment and go straight, probably due both to his record and the onset of Great Depression economic calamity. He couldn't find work, though. He was also badgered by lawmen, including arrests for vagrancy. That's just hanging out where you're not appreciated, in various states. He eventually turned back to crime, and thus began the downward spiral that ended only with his death. Still, innumerable witnesses suggested that he was a very different sort of criminal, even if a violent criminal. William Cunningham's acclaimed 1936 novel Pretty Boy helped lionize the image of this infamous desperado as some sort of Robin Hood character who robbed from the rich, back then it was the bankers, and shared the proceeds with friends, family, and other poor folks. For a long time in the early 1930s, Muskogee reporter Vivian Brown dismissed such claims, numerous as they were. According to the Kansas City Star newspaper, however, Brown traveled throughout the region and concluded that the tales were true. Floyd, Vivian Brown wrote, did give money to the poverty-racked farmers he befriended in those hard-scrabble hills. Vivian Brown herself eventually wrote in the Oklahoma City Times newspaper, quote, like the famed marauder of the English forests, Robin Hood, he took money from those who had it, the banks, and divided the proceeds with the poor. The penniless tenant farmers kept their mouths shut. They had no scruples about taking contraband wrested from bankers, end quote. Well, Eastern Oklahomans' attitudes toward lawmen in a multitude of cases when they broach the subject of Floyd supports that notion. Shannon Magnus of Salisaw provides just one example, and I'm quoting her now. The folks all around here knew Charlie Floyd, and they liked him. My own uncle, Taft Reed, told me that once when he was working on a local WPA road project, Charlie pulled up in his car and handed the men on that job a bag full of money, just gave them all of that bank money. Well, in the book, The Life and Death of Pretty Boy Floyd, Floyd's biographer, Jeffrey S. King, chronicled the bank robber's generosity in cash to those who helped him, such as letting him hide out in their homes. According to King, Floyd provided groceries to 12 poor families. Thomas Pinson, meanwhile, recalled of his early 1930s Tulsa boyhood that, quote, it got to be common knowledge that Pretty Boy was around there and had a good-looking wife, but nobody was afraid or lived in terror or anything like that. In fact, he helped my dad change a flat tire down on the corner of Garrison Avenue one day. We all knew that Pretty Boy wasn't such a bad guy. We always heard that he was good to most folks and that he'd steal from the rich and give to the poor. He was no crazed killer. Floyd pulled over another time in the middle of the night to change the flat tire of a man who turned out to be a state legislator from Seminole. Deputies soon pulled over on the lonely road as he finished the task. When they lingered, Charlie swung out his machine gun, disarmed them, and ordered them in colorful language to get out of here. They did so without harm, while Floyd skedaddled the opposite direction. An Earlsboro native, Pauline Alfrey, recounted her and twin brother Buck's experiences with Floyd. We were just young teenagers trying to get through the Depression, Alfrey said years later, and after school, Buck and I would head for the old drugstore, and each of us would get a nickel ice cream cone. One afternoon, we were sitting there with our cones, and in walks Pretty Boy Floyd. Everybody was buzzing about him. He was so handsome. His clothes were neat, and he wore gloves. He ordered himself a Coca-Cola and drank it down, and as he turned to leave, he gave us a wink. Well, we were ready to leave too, and when we went to pay for our ice cream, we found out he had already taken care of it for us. Were we ever happy? We had enough money to get a slice of pie, end quote. Lest we forget though, Gwen, Charlie Floyd didn't grow famous for buying kids ice cream cones or changing folks flat tires for them. He was a bank robber who carried a pistol and a machine gun. And those crimes led to worse, much more violent ones, which we'll explore after the break.
He was a bad boy. I can hardly wait for the golden nugget. This is Oklahoma Gold. Pretty Boy Floyd. John J. Dwyer, was he a bad boy?
Well, Gwen, it's indisputable that the key factor forging Charles Pretty Boy Floyd's legend garnered him interest, respect, and contempt, depending on one's station in society, was a singular series of daring, even sensational bad boy exploits. Hollywood epics then and now fabricated such deeds, but Chalk Floyd actually did them. You want to hear some of them?
I do.
For one, he lunged from a speeding, rolling, flaming car while being pursued that he was driving, then dragged his colleague to safety. He also escaped from FBI custody in 1930 by leaping undetected off a moving train in the dark in rural Ohio onto the ground at a high rate of speed while shackled. Then in 1931, a large posse of Kansas City detectives and federal agents sacked a bootlegging center. They captured everyone in the place except Floyd, who coolly feigned that he was drunk at a card table, then pitched an object across the room to distract the cluster of armed lawmen, whipped out his own Colt 45 and bolted for the door. A ferocious gun battle erupted between Floyd and the lawmen. With nearly every officer in the building firing at him, he shot two of them in the card room, burst through a splintered door, and shot two more while racing down a hallway and stairs and out of the building, then speeding away. You think that was something? Here's what he did in Tulsa. A series of nearly unbelievable shootouts and escapes in 1932 catapulted Charlie Floyd to near mythical status in the national consciousness. On February 7th, a carload of heavily armed detectives ambushed him and colleague George Birdwell at the corner of Peoria and Apache. Floyd emerged from his vehicle and raked the police car from stem to stern with machine gun bullets, wounding one lawman and sending the others scurrying. A running gun battle in the middle of Tulsa and speeding autos ensued, in which one detective swore that he fired 6 shots at Floyd from point-blank range without phasing him. Floyd and Birdwell both escaped. 3 nights later, other lawmen ambushed Floyd and Birdwell at 5th and Utica, but the bandits' guns again roared back at them. Floyd shot out the police car's illumined headlights and riddled its radiator, raced his own car up a steep hill and along the Frisco Railroad tracks, then escaped on foot through the darkened area. The next day, at least 20 more officers, armed to the teeth and accompanied by an armored car, surrounded Floyd and Birdwell at Floyd's own Tulsa home. They fired tear gas into it. After no one emerged, they stormed the structure and found it empty. The robbers had blithely slipped through a cordon of officers in the backyard by using 2 rows of laundry hung on clotheslines as a shield from detection. The Tulsa World newspaper called that a cool and daring escape. Well, at this point, one of Oklahoma's most respected and famous lawmen, 46-year-old retired McIntosh County Sheriff Irv Kelly, volunteered his services to the state authorities to catch Floyd and the enormous bounty now on his head. Kelly had hunted down and brought in 14 bank robbers and 6 murderers in his career without ever having to fire a shot. After 3 months of bird-dogging him, he succeeded in tracking down Floyd as well. Kelly and another man surprised Floyd in the middle of the night when he attempted to visit his ex-wife and son outside of Bixby. Perhaps the most famous gunfight in Oklahoma history ensued. Though bushwhacked, the wary Floyd was alert when Kelly drew down on him with a machine gun from no more than 10 feet away. Chalk swung his Colt 45 up and blazed away in the face of furious and deadly fire. Floyd was hit 4 times by Kelly's machine gun, though all below the waist. Floyd's aim, meanwhile, was deadly. He hit Kelly 5 times in 7 shots, 2 of them kill shots. So determined were these brave men that Kelly fell to the ground and died, still pressing the trigger of his machine gun with his finger and spraying bullets into the dirt. Birdwell and a bleeding Floyd again outraced a swarm of pursuers to safety. Soon, over 500 lawmen were blanketing eastern Oklahoma in search of them. Sometime during this period, Wiley Post led a 2-airplane search patrol. Well, in view of all these and many other adventures, coupled with the general sense that he was at least partly driven to it by circumstances and an unforgiving Great Depression-era system, as well as his congenial attitude and never-shoot-first ethos, it's not surprising that Floyd was roundly considered a latter-day outlaw in the romantic vein of Jesse James, nor that Thomas J. Higgins, Kansas City Chief of Detectives, remarked that Floyd had one of the quickest draws I've ever seen, and he's the best shot with a pistol I've ever seen. Well, no less than OSBI legend Dick Wilkerson said of Charlie Floyd, he was incredibly brave and he really did have a code. Well, as you might imagine, though, no matter how polite and supposedly sporting Charles Pretty Boy Floyd may have been, robbing banks with a machine gun and shooting it out with lawmen was not destined to lead to a happy ending. Our golden nugget this time, Gwen, is to say that the conclusion of this story next time includes one of the most infamous gangland massacres in American history, Pretty Boy Floyd's legendary final shootout and the haunting legacy of his enigmatic relationship with God.
There's more Oklahoma gold. Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Falconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we share. When last we talked to John J. Dwyer, pretty boy Floyd was full of bullets, and yet you say there's more? John J. Dwyer, what happened?
Well, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, or Chalk or Charlie as he was called by friends, he hated the Pretty Boy nickname, took a licking and kept on ticking, you might say. He was an Oklahoman from the Cookson Hills. We talked about that last time. We also explored the good nature and politeness that distinguished him from other criminals, his unique habit of sharing the proceeds of his robberies with the common folks of Oklahoma, and their unusual loyalty to him. Also, his refusal ever to shoot first without being shot at, his legendary skill with a gun, and how a series of bad breaks and bad times contributed to his descent into crime and tragedy. Floyd's most audacious exploit may have been robbing the bank at Sallisaw in far eastern Oklahoma, around where he grew up. Best-selling author Michael Wallace, who I know is familiar to a lot of our listeners, set the stage in his seminal Floyd biography entitled Pretty Boy. It was not as if the job was a well-guarded secret, Wallace wrote of the Sallisaw robbery. Several of Chalk's friends and practically the entire Floyd clan, including various in-laws and cousins, knew it was going to take place. Chalk's grandfather, Charles Murphy Floyd, who had just turned 75, got duded up in fresh overalls. He came into town from Aikens that morning just to watch the proceedings. The old man took up a place of honor near the train station, directly across the street from the bank. Several of his cronies also gathered there. While they waited for Charlie and his two friends to arrive, the men chewed tobacco and talked drought, the Depression, and politics. And that's the end of Michael Wallace's colorful quote. Well, from the moment Floyd got to Sallisaw that day till he left a half hour or so later, he chatted with friends and acquaintances. Casually toting his submachine gun in the crook of his arm, almost as though it were a formality, he cordially asked the barber next door to lay off his phone while he robbed the bank. "Oh, you bet we will," the barber replied. "Good to see you, fellas," Floyd said, touching his cap. "Howdy, what you doing in town, Chalk?" a farmer in the street greeted him. "How you, Newt? We're going to rob the bank," Floyd replied. "Give 'em hell," Newt responded. End quote. In Wallace's classic account of this robbery, as customers entered the bank, Floyd greeted each of them with a big smile and shook their hands. He called one friend out of the so-called captives line and engaged him in a friendly conversation. Meanwhile, Sheriff Burt Cotton, who was actually an intrepid lawman who knew Floyd and had arrested him in Sallisaw years before for the crime that sent him to prison, well, Cotton sat in his patrol car just around the corner of the bank, no more than 75 feet away from the front door. Later, Cotton stated that he knew nothing of the robbery until friends informed him of it after Floyd left town. It was like the hometown performance of a great actor who has made good on Broadway, wrote one newspaper reporter. Once again, Pretty Boy had taken the public's mind off farm foreclosures and bank failures, said author Michael Wallace of the handsome, athletic, winsome Phantom of the Ozarks. His life was a continuous gangster movie for the disenfranchised to relish, Wallace continued. The little people of the land fed vicariously from his exploits. Through Floyd, they were able to punch back, end quote. "I never shot at a fellow in my life unless I was forced into it by some trap, and then it was that or else," Floyd told Muskogee reporter Vivian Brown in her exclusive interview with him, which was conducted in secret deep in the Cookson Hills. The common folks knew that, and that it was different from other gangsters of the era. Well, during Floyd's life and since, he has caught blame for far more deeds than the many he actually committed. These included a supposed super gang robbery of a South Bend, Indiana bank with John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and others. In some cases, he was accused of as many as 3 different crimes, all in different states at the same time. Witnesses and even lawmen would mistakenly, sometimes on purpose, identify him in crimes, and criminals would often claim to be him when caught. The grip this latter-day Jesse James held on the collective American consciousness, from an obsessed FBI director J. Edgar Hoover to the national media to unemployed sharecroppers, contributed to this. Indeed, the most famous exploit of Charlie Floyd's life was one he almost certainly had nothing to do with. The June 1933 Union Station Massacre in Kansas City proved a watershed event in American history. The slaughter of several lawmen, federal as well as local, triggered a national fury that delivered Hoover, deftly playing upon it the authority and power he had long desired for the soon-to-be-named Federal Bureau of Investigation. It also smeared Floyd's name. As has often been the case in tragic events in American history, much, if not most, of the official story was wrong. Here, several gangsters ambushed and murdered a posse of lawmen escorting another notorious criminal from the Kansas City train station to Leavenworth Federal Prison. Enraged at Floyd's continued embarrassment of his bureau, as well as law enforcement agencies around the country, J. Edgar Hoover used selective evidence and unreliable testimony, especially that of his chief witness, who described a non-existent wound to Floyd, to, unwittingly or not, frame the Oklahoman for the heinous crime. In reality, Floyd's worst action had been, to his eternal regret and consequence, to have simply been in the same city at the same time as the massacre. Numerous prominent lawmen, including the respected Kansas City Chief of Detectives, Thomas J. Higgins, dismissed Floyd's involvement. Even the surviving trio of federal agents filed official eyewitness reports absent of any identification or even suspicion of Floyd as a participant. In a sad echo of controversial later FBI investigations, though, such as the Oklahoma City bombing, all 3 survivors suddenly changed their minds many months later and only then pegged Floyd as a participant. Well, the most compelling exculpatory evidence for Floyd in the Kansas City massacre remains the utter lack of precedent at any time in his life for such actions. He was never a torpedo or hired gun for pay, and the Union Station massacre ran counter to his temperament and character, despite his other crimes. Floyd himself, upon hearing he was suspected, immediately sent a note to the Kansas City police, who already did not consider him a suspect. Floyd's note to them read, quote, "Dear sirs, I, Charles Floyd, want it made known that I did not participate in the massacre of officers at Kansas City. Charles Floyd," end quote. Well, with the death of John Dillinger, Oklahoma's own Charlie Floyd, famously known as Pretty Boy Floyd, ascended to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's public enemy number 1. A national dragnet stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific for him. He shrewdly laid low for nearly a year and a half. When he did finally emerge, his luck ran out. We'll find out how and dig up a bittersweet golden nugget after the break.
Pretty Boy Floyd didn't do it. That's Oklahoma Gold. So Pretty Boy Floyd was blamed for something he didn't do? John J. Dwyer? What's the golden nugget?
Well, Gwen, it's a different sort of golden nugget. Heading down the final chapters of his life, in October 1934, famous gangster John Dillinger's famous nemesis, FBI Special Agent Melvin Purvis, and his combined posse of federal, state, and local agents finally cornered Charles Pretty Boy Floyd in rural Ohio and unleashed a volley of fire at the Oklahoman. He fell wounded and died minutes later after the lawmen reached him. Beyond that, however, nearly everything about those events is disputed nearly 90 years later. By far the most controversial issue is elite marksman, posse member, and Ohio Deputy Sheriff Chester S. Smith's electrifying contention that Melvin Purvis ordered a fellow bureau agent to murder Floyd where he sat after the wounded but coherent outlaw defiantly refused to answer questions about the Union Station massacre in Kansas City. The LA Times, Time Magazine, and other publications reported the career lawman's revelations in the 1970s, but Smith's Ohio family and acquaintances had known them for decades, and they believed them. In addition, Lisbon, Ohio Deputy Sheriff George Hayes, who shot it out with Floyd during the final pursuit and was nearly killed by him, claimed he was told the same account of Floyd's death by other posse witnesses. Chester Smith, meanwhile, told the Lisbon, Ohio Morning Journal it was a cover-up, and he told Time that the FBI, quote, didn't want it to get out that he'd been killed that way, end quote. Well, assuming Floyd's innocence in the Kansas City massacre that we talked about in the first part, the close observer of his bloody conflict with the Bureau might also ponder the latter's possible temptation to silence his potentially explosive testimony regarding that crime, of which he was probably unjustly accused, and which catapulted Hoover and his organization to unprecedented power and prominence. The pall of death, meanwhile, wrote the Muskogee Phoenix newspaper, fell over Sallisaw as a sorrowing hill country people heard the news that they had expected from day to day for a long time. Floyd biographer Michael Wallace, who we've quoted before, depicted the widespread Bible Belt mood, which can only be interpreted, in my opinion, as inscrutable by the modern American. Here's what Wallace wrote, quote, Sequoia County was in a state of mourning. In country villages scattered over the Oklahoma hills and in oil patch towns, people who had followed the bandits' exploits for years had a difficult time accepting his death. It seemed to symbolize for many folks, particularly the poor, something in themselves that was now gone, end quote. Biographers such as Jeffrey King have also chronicled Floyd's intensely religious beliefs. That's right, intensely religious. The Floyd clan, including Charlie's mother, possessed a devout heritage, and all 5 of his surviving siblings seem to have followed in it. Even Floyd apparently never completely escaped the strong Christian influence of his upbringing. Despite a dangerous and bloody life, where year after year any breath could be your last, the remembrances of numerous witnesses in various locations indicate that Floyd apparently attended church services whenever and wherever able. One of his partners, in fact, frequently read scriptures aloud to Floyd from a Bible as they traveled. A.M. Goodson, faithful member of a Baptist church in Shawnee, recalled Floyd attending a Sunday evening service there in January 1932. The robber left a very large donation, in Goodson's words, in the offering plate. Goodson recognized him during the service and afterwards introduced himself, not hiding his recognition of the notorious outlaw. Give my best wishes to the minister, Floyd told Goodson, and tell him I want to be saved, end quote. Well, Floyd also urged his son Dempsey and other children to attend church and school, to not break the law, but to become law-abiding citizens and lawyers. He supported his ex-wife Ruby's desire that Dempsey be baptized, which he was. And as we discussed earlier, Gwen, Floyd's demeanor and actions toward nearly everyone, even whilst committing crimes, differed from the average criminal, especially those of violent national repute and public enemy number 1 stature. He repeatedly apologized to those whose lives he disrupted. He treated them respectfully and assured them he had no desire to harm them, and typically didn't. He gave them cash and other things for their trouble, including a set of golf clubs to a Missouri sheriff he temporarily captured. Upon learning a man whom he and a colleague were striking was a sheriff and not a bounty hunter, Floyd immediately stopped the beating, apologized to the lawman, gave him a much larger than needed amount for medical treatment, and released him. Well, Chalk Floyd had attended Mother's Day 1933 Sunday worship services with his mom at the First Baptist Church of Sallisaw. 27 Floyds faithfully attended there. As often they had, they in a full house heard the Reverend W.E. Rocket preach with Charlie in full peaceable view. Afterwards, Floyd and his mom visited his father's grave near Aikens and adorned it with flowers. Indicating a nearby spot, he told his mom, "Right here is where you can put me. I expect to go down soon with lead in me. Perhaps the sooner, the better."
Charles Pretty Boy Floyd. Now that's Oklahoma gold.